Gojo has just been cut and pierced straight through his abdomen, and it's by this random man holding this katana. Not only has someone breached through the infinity, but they also have zero cursed energy. That monster was Toji Zenin, but he's pretty much not going to be in today's video. Today we're going to be talking about Yuta Okkotsu. Instead of Toji Zenin, Yuta is going to be given the same mission as Toji to go take down the star plasma vessel. Would this ever actually happen? Obviously not, but at the same time, you know, cool topic, so make sure you leave a like on the video. Let's say Yuta was given the same information as Toji, except within this timeline, he's also been casted away and separated by others because of his cursed spirit Rika. But eventually he learned how to control and even master this power all on his own while hating the Jujutsu world for making him feel so alone. Yuta is still just as strong, but he doesn't have the love for others that he holds like the original timeline. He and Toji share that dynamic and hate for being separated by others around them, and it's good enough to make Yuta the low-key antagonist of this video. Yuta is contacted by Shiu Kong, who's the Korean citizen that also has connections that landed him the opportunity to take down the Six Eyes. Yuta doesn't spare any extra thought and immediately accepts this offer, and now it's time to figure out exactly how he'll be attempting taking down the strongest of this current era. Yuta still has all of his power and nothing really changes when it comes to his arsenal in this version of the timeline, but that still doesn't make things easy for Okkotsu because after all, this is Satoru Gojo. His first problem is going to be the Six Eyes, and Toji knew that even without cursed energy, those eyes would instantly alert Gojo of any incoming danger. It seemed to be Toji's main concern when talking about the strategy with the Korean agent, but that's because the Limitless curse technique itself just wasn't that problematic. There was always the inverted spear of heaven, and Yuta actually has something similar. After copying Angel's curse technique, he now has access to Jacob's ladder, and it's like the blade that Toji used, but there's one crucial difference. The inverted spear of heaven forcibly turns off curse techniques on contact, and Jacob's ladder doesn't. This technique is pretty much Angel extinguishing curse techniques, and it seems to work by burning out the targets, like the word choice by Gege using extinguishing sounds. There's also multiple times where the charge up period needed the targets to be distracted or flat out held in place before the attack could be fired, and otherwise they probably could have just avoided Jacob's ladder altogether. Yuta could just command Rika to go and grab Gojo just like Itadori and set up the curse technique that way, but this obviously won't work either because neither of them can bypass infinity. There's also the issue with how would Yuta even know about the Limitless either? Toji knew because he's from the Zenin clan, and Gojo himself explained that it's not that crazy considering that the manuals for these techniques have leaked out the family in the last 100 years. But Yuta obviously isn't part of any big family like the Zenins, and it's hard to imagine why he would know about infinity or even be able to prepare properly. Realistically, he'd probably enter unprepared just because he doesn't have the knowledge that Toji had, and even then it was still very intense. Nothing about this for Yuta is going to be simple, and knowing the legend Satoru Gojo and the Six Eyes, Yuta probably wouldn't enter unprepared without knowing about his opponent, especially on this caliber. It might not be totally in character, but the smartest thing for Yuta would be placing the original bounty on the Six Eyes. Not only would wearing him down help with these encounters, but it's going to grant him the opportunity to observe his techniques and fighting style. Yuta knows about the advantage that sorcerers have with hidden techniques and cards up their sleeves, and it's particularly why the copy technique is extremely formidable. Something like this makes sense, and this is also where this video really begins to pick up. Just like the original timeline, Gojo and Geto protect Riko and continue transporting her across Japan. Along their way there's obstacles, but none of them can really stop either of these monsters. Suguru Geto is just as strong as Satoru Gojo, and at this point in the story they're considered equals. Together they are the strongest, and Gojo has the advantage with the Six Eye and Limitless, which is probably why in the original timeline he can slightly react to Toji, whereas Geto got completely bodied. But the point narratively and combat wise is that both of them can keep up with one another and understand each other. Gojo would probably win, but they aren't being compared as opponents. They're being compared as teammates that have no problem working together and matching each other's combat ability. High-level sorcerers like Kashimo can shut down their cursed energy and cloak their presence, and Yuta can probably do the same. Hiding is going to be the best place to sit back and observe while using his genius to break down and understand his targets. When the paper bag head assassin guy arrives, there's going to be tons of information to break down. Gojo reveals two crucial parts about his curse technique. Infinity is the neutral Limitless, and this sounds extremely complicated, but for the sake of the video, Infinity is this barrier that completely surrounds Gojo, and unless you have some type of technique that can either neutralize or bypass curse techniques, then you pretty much can't do anything against Gojo. Throughout these interactions with the paper bag head assassin, Gojo gives the entire breakdown on his Infinity, even giving the example of Achilles and the tortoise, which is the same paradox that keeps his opponents from making physical contact with him through spatial manipulation. He later continues to use Lapse Blue, which is the subtraction of space using the Limitless curse technique. This technique can pull its targets between 2 points instead of the neutral Limitless being Infinity, which which just slows down the targets altogether. Gojo unknowingly gives the entire download and summary of his curse technique to the paper bag guy, and unknowingly he just fed all of this information to Yuta Okkotsu. But at the last moment, just like the original timeline, he raises his hands and Gojo attempts using a reversal red, but it obviously fails. Yuta doesn't really think much of anything that he just saw, except for the fact that he now has to account for infinity in blue. There's one other technique that he could encounter if Gojo manages to figure out whatever that red technique was supposed to be, but for now he's going to continue with his plan until he sees Suguru Geto. Curse spirit manipulation could be more problematic than the Limitless curse technique, but not for Yuta. Rika, just like the original timeline, is the perfect target for this type of technique. Yuta isn't sure about the exact conditions that Geto needs to absorb Rika, but he's also highly doubtful that a spirit as strong as Rika can be absorbed so easily. Rika is the strongest cursed spirit that we've ever seen, and her cursed energy pool is considered boundless. Rika alone fuels Yuta's entire cursed energy pool when they're linked, and that's about roughly half the size of Ryomen Sukuna's entire pool. Normally, Geto needs to be substantially stronger than his chosen target cursed spirits, and that's why in Volume 0 and in the original timeline, he can't just immediately absorb Rika. But then again, Yuta doesn't know that at this very moment, and that's exactly why he's gonna be worried to play this mission extra safe. Toji waited until Gojo and Geto reached the barrier to create the illusion of security. That's because the barrier surrounding the school will instantly alert the others of anybody threatening entering its radius. That's why Geto can't normally use his curse technique to spawn cursed spirits during school hours, because they might mistake his technique for actual threats and dangerous special grade curse spirits. If Yuta enters the barrier, then his presence is going to be picked up by the entire school, and that's not exactly ideal for hunting down Riko. Attacking the group in the same position as Toji isn't optimal. Yuta isn't invisible like Toji, who can enter the barrier without being detected because he didn't have a single ounce of cursed energy. The smartest thing to do would be to wait until the group gets close to the school, but attack them before they enter the barrier. This should preferably be closer to the end of the mission, just so Yuta can gather as much intel as possible, so just outside the barrier should be pretty fine. When crossing back about 1 mile from Jujutsu High, the group senses one of the largest cursed energy presence that they've ever felt, and it's something that's different from Gojo's, something entirely creepier. Just like Bagman, Yuta doesn't enter via sneak attack, and instead, he intends for all of his surprises to be his curse techniques. This plan starts with keeping Rika unsummoned. That's because Yuta's already seen curse spirit manipulation and the Six Eyes in action. Geto's curse technique is dangerous for reasons that I've already mentioned, but Yuta's already seen the Six Eyes break down curse techniques. Part of the reason why his curse technique copy is extremely formidable is because of the confusion that it causes before his targets manage to figure out how the hell Yuta is manipulating more than one curse technique at a time. Both Oro and Ryu were caught extremely off guard and even thinking that he's just a curse speech user. Using the Six Eyes, Gojo can figure out copy nearly instantly, but Yuta notices something important. Those eyes are needed to witness the technique in action before breaking them down, and overall this theory is pretty consistent. The version of Gojo with more experience in the future wasn't able to see that Sukuna was fully manipulating the 10 shadows until Maharaga appeared, despite him already being active for the last 2 domain expansions. If breaking down your opponent's curse technique was that simple and Gojo could instantly know if somebody was using a curse technique or not, or exactly what their curse technique might be just by looking at them, then he would have never been caught off guard by Maharaga. Gojo's Six Eyes allow him to see the flow of cursed energy on a level completely beyond a normal sorcerer. He can read a technique while it's active to determine its effects, and keeping your curse technique inactive should make cracking your technique impossible. That's why Yuta is going to be saving Rika and his copy curse technique until later, because at the moment, his target is Riko. Toji figured taking her down is impossible when she's being guarded by Satoru Gojo. Taking down Gojo was necessary to complete his mission, and it's the same for Yuta. This made going after the Six Eyes his primary focus, except unlike Toji, there's no sneak attack or real illusion of safety. One advantage that Yuta does have is that Gojo is still probably gassed and completely exhausted after using Infinity for the last 3 days on end. Gojo has been maintaining Infinity outside the barrier pretty much the entire time. He knows he's gonna have that advantage going into the fight, and now without Rika present or even summoned, Yuta rushes at Riko Amane to provoke Gojo into engaging himself into this fight, which is exactly what he needed. Taking out Gojo is Yuta's first priority, and forcing Geto to leave protecting Riko makes things easier. Yuta's plan ended up working perfectly, and by rushing Riko, leading to both of the strongest using their curse techniques to save her, turns this fight into a real 1v1. Both Gojo and Geto feel Yuta's overwhelming cursed energy as something totally different than anything the world has ever seen. Yuta has more cursed energy now than Gojo will in 10 years. With his speed from the initial attack being far above any other assassin who followed until this point, Geto had every reason to rush Riko into the barrier, leaving Gojo behind but confident in his ability to win, but unfortunately this was a complete complete miscalculation. Estimating the outcome and trying to figure out the result of this fight is pretty complicated, and that's mostly because it all depends on how you think about this version of Gojo scaling in comparison to Geto and Toji Zenin from the original story. Toji isn't sure about being capable of taking down Gojo when talking with the Korean agent who offered him the job in the first place. That being said, it's also true that Toji probably hasn't seen him since the encounter probably 10 or 11 years in the past. It's also stated within this volume extra from Shibuya that Gojo and Toji at some point were around the same level of power. We're not given any information on exactly which version of these characters they're talking about, and at first it really doesn't make any sense. It's definitely not the version of Gojo who fried Toji in the rematch, or obviously the Gojo when he's an adult in the modern era. The only real interpretation that makes sense would be this version of Gojo from Hidden Inventory before he was exhausted using his infinity. You could also argue that this doesn't make sense either because Toji bodied Geto in the original timeline, who is also supposed to be around Gojo's level of power and apparently stated to be Toji Zenin's equal. This argument isn't necessarily bad, but in context, Gojo and Geto are capable of keeping up with each other as teammates, and in every context, these statements are referring to them fighting alongside each other and not against one another. It would make more sense if the statements were directly saying that Gojo and Geto were comparable in power as opponents, but they have that understanding with each other because they can fight alongside each other. What I'm really trying to say is that it doesn't really make sense to read the statement of them being on the same level and interpret that as them being dead equal. It's completely different to claim both of them as being around the same level as opponents rather than teammates. After all, Geto literally has no answer to bypass infinity, so this argument about them being equal in power as combatants really doesn't make any sense. Not to mention the multiple notes left behind by the editors that call Gojo the quote-unquote strongest, and this is during his first fight with Toji with Geto literally present in frame. But even if you wanted to be extremely generous to Gojo, Toji really isn't confident in beating a Gojo at peak condition, which isn't the Gojo that we're using for this video. I'm gonna circle back to all this later, and for now let's talk about Yuta. Yuta should be around the same level as the other heavy-hitting fighters at Jujutsu High, that being Maki Zenin, Kinji Ikari, and arguably Yuji Itadori. Maki in specific is important for scaling this encounter because she's equal with Toji himself. After mastering and achieving the full potential of her heavenly restriction, which is the same curse that granted Toji insane physical ability, Maki Zenin is Toji's stated equal. Some could argue that Maki got stronger, but I've covered that point in other videos like Yuji versus Toji, so I'll let you watch that later. But for the sake of the video, Maki and Toji are equals, even when Yuta and Maki should be around the same level. Even if you think that one is slightly above, it doesn't really matter. If Yuta is capable of keeping up with Maki's movements, who's the same speed as the version of Toji that blitzed Gojo, then the outcome should be pretty obvious. Some Gojo fans would argue that this version of fatigued and exhausted Gojo could still keep up with Toji, but that's really not true whatsoever. There's only one instance where he does react against Toji, and it's using blue during the first real exchange they shared for the entire fight. He does react here in all fairness, but it's pretty misleading to then argue that Gojo can react to Toji's combat speed if they were trading blows in hand to hand. That's because not only is this using blue, which is probably far easier than targeting and landing blows past your opponent's defenses, but Toji takes the wildest running start I've ever seen. Speed is calculated by taking the distance of the object and dividing that by the time it took them to arrive at the destination, and this is important because any rational person would agree based on that principle in physics that objects that start off with a greater distance require slower speeds to successfully react against once in motion. Not only did Toji start off decently far away, but he also jumped from rooftop to rooftop, which gave Gojo more time to anticipate the attack incoming, unlike just running at him straight away. In close quarters, both Gojo and Geto can't do anything against him, which makes sense considering that they're around the same level if you don't think that Gojo is slightly above. Yuta should be capable of matching or even overpowering this fatigued, exhausted version of Gojo, even without starting off the real fight with any major surprise attacks. Yuta dashes again at Gojo once he's sure that both of them are alone, and that's because the presence unleashed by putting on the ring would draw too much attention when Yuta expands his domain. True mutual love expands, and unfortunately Gojo is trapped inside. This was the plan all along and the obvious counter against infinity. The domain summons an infinite amount of swords, all stored with techniques that Yuta has copied over the years. Once grabbing and activating the technique inside, it will disappear from the caster's hands. Besides these one-time use techniques, the domain itself does have its own sure hit, which I would assume Yuta can customize every time he expands his domain. We've only seen him imbue the domain sure hit with Jacob's Ladder, but that was because the plan to save Megami was by extinguishing Sukuna. It's not ever stated explicitly, but I'm pretty sure that Yuta would be able to customize the domain sure hit to pretty much anything he decides, and as long as it's copied within his arsenal. At this point in the story, we can't really say that Gojo's mastered his domain Infinite Void. We've only been given confirmation that he unlocked his domain expansion after the year-long time skip that happens after his fight with Toji in the original timeline. It's just blatantly making an assumption, arguing that he would activate Infinite Void once trapped inside Yuta's domain. Gojo's only hope is pretty much using Falling Blossom, and this domain countermeasure is something that he's mastered from an early age, but we've never really seen Gojo use it besides that time that he was stuck within Malevolent Shrine. You can't really say Falling Blossom would shatter like a simple domain and Hollow Wicker Basket because they are fundamentally different, but the problem is that even if Gojo is guarding himself from the sure hit, he's still going to be left open to actual physical damage. Falling Blossom seems to require the caster maintaining this pose and hand sign, which when undone would shut down the technique. Once Yuta closes that distance, nearly any sword within the domain will be capable of pushing Gojo around far enough to end the Falling Blossom, leaving him open to one or maybe even several finishing blows, which would end the battle before it could ever truly have started. Unlike Toji, this fight ends here more permanently, as Yuta within this timeline wouldn't make the mistake of keeping Gojo alive, since that only happened because of the miscalculation about the reverse curse technique. Yuta knows that positive energy, which is essential for using the reverse curse technique, would start from the head, unlike Toji. Gojo himself in the original timeline pretty much explains this to Toji, and that's the one miscalculation he made that would have ended the battle. But Yuta not only having the reverse curse technique, but also a pretty good fundamental understanding in how it functions, would pretty much end this battle more permanently, like I've already mentioned. For those wondering about Rika, well, she never made it inside the domain, and that's because similar to what happened in Sendai Colony, she purposely remained outside the barrier. Yuta and Rika planned for this deliberately, as there was pretty much only one way that Geto can go back into the school, directly in front of where Gojo was fighting Yuta. Rika engaged with Geto pretty much immediately once Yuta figured out that Geto was far enough from Gojo. Yuta risked having Rika fight Geto despite Curse Spirit manipulation because he knew that Riko's presence would be trouble. Having to keep Riko safe while also making the entire situation more stressful would give Rika the high ground. Rika is obviously much stronger than Geto, and with having to keep Riko safe, it was pretty much impossible, ending this video pretty anticlimactic, with Gojo never awakening in this timeline and Geto being defeated rather easily by Rika, who's strong enough to beat him 10 years later in the future. There's no more 6-eye user in the modern day, Tengen's merger never happens, Kenjaku never finds his next vessel, and that's pretty much it unless you guys want a really complicated part 2.